Well, our first stop is the Pima Air and Space Museum. We've been here about 5 or 6 years ago, and I'm really looking forward to coming out again. We've got some new airplanes on display, and it should be a great time. We'll give you a quick tour as we work our way through the museum. When we're coming up to the entrance, this particular museum is probably one of the top 3 or 4 air museums in the country, behind the Air Force Museum and the Air and Space Museum by the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. Primarily because the weather here allows so many of the airplanes to be displayed outside, as you'll see as we make the tour. If you're in the Tucson area and you like airplanes, this is a don't miss stop. The museum has several large air-conditioned hangars housing much of their collection. There are several hangars with a variety of aircraft, a space display area, a gift shop, and acres of displays on the museum grounds. One interesting tidbit is the museum is pet-friendly. Leashed pets are welcome both inside and outside. With the warm temps throughout much of the year, leaving pets in cars or RVs is a really bad idea. Just about any movie about the Vietnam War will have numerous UH-1 Hueys. This F-4 is painted in the U.S. Air Force Thunderbird colors. I remember as a kid seeing the Thunderbirds fly the F-4. What was particularly striking about their performance was how noisy it was. Your organs just vibrated in your chest with 6 of these airplanes overhead and all their engines and afterburners. Oh my goodness. The F-4 was known as the Phantom II. What was the Phantom I? Here it is. This is an F-84. If you notice the O preceding the tail number, it represented obsolete. After a few tours around the Air Force, the generals noticed a lot of their airplanes had O's in front of them. So they stopped doing that as they figured out that they would make these airplanes last longer and use them longer than originally planned. This F-107 is part of the Century series of airplanes. Really didn't fly these. Having the big intake on top of the canopy like that, they were kind of jokingly referred to as man-eaters, in that the ejection seat would push you past the intake if you had to get out in a hurry. So the F-107 was one of those Century series airplanes that really didn't make it into production. When the U.S. first entered the Korean War, they were flying some of their first generation jet fighters, such as the P-80, and they discovered the North Koreans and the Chinese were flying this little guy, the MiG-15, and that they needed more maneuverability and more speed to keep up with it. Parked right beside it was the answer to that problem. The F-86 Sabre, built by North American. It was a much faster and much more maneuverable airplane and was able to give the MiG-15 a run for its money. When you added to the skill of the American pilots, the loss ratio from the F-86 to the MiG-15 was quite noticeable in favor of the F-86. As I mentioned as we entered the place, one of the really cool things about this airport museum or airplane museum is all the outside space. And so you can have big airplanes and lots of them to see. Some of these fighters were some of the first generation jet fighters. It was fun as a kid going to air shows because Air National Guard units would still be flying these. And so you could go to a show and see 10 or 15 different kinds of fighters, whereas today, they're a little bit more limited. In this pan shot, you can see a bunch of the Century Series fighters that the Air Force used. You've got the F-100, the F-102, the F-106 with the short tail, and then over behind me, the F-105. The F-105 is a Wild Weasel. So all those were part of the airplanes that were called the Century Series, including the one inside, the 107 that we talked about earlier. I don't know if you can see it in the shade, but under this work area is a B-52D that's undergoing restoration. That'll be joining the collection here, I'm sure, pretty soon. This little guy is a T-37. It was flown at Enid, that's Vance Air Force Base in Oklahoma. Got a lot of time in T-37s, and in fact, flew this one. I was surprised to see the tail number down here the last time I visited. I'll tell you, it makes you feel a little old when the tools that you used are now in a museum. T-37B Tweet. This B-36 was under renovation when I was here last. One of the reasons I wanted to stop today was to get a chance to see it up close. You see it had 6 aft-mounted propeller engines, reciprocating engines, and then 4 jets, 2 on each wing. The thing would be ready to go, and the flight engineer would announce that he had 6 turning and 4 burning. This KC-97 reminds me of a flight I had a chance to take when I was in pilot training. In one of these, it's filled with big fuel tanks inside, and we were refueling some fighters. The KC-97 had the throttles all the way forward, going as fast as it could, while the fighters had their flaps down and were just hanging in the air. The speed mismatch between the two airplanes was pretty amazing. The active duty Air Force was flying the KC-135, which they're still flying. The Guard had these KC-97s, and they're not flying anymore. They just can't keep up with the modern jet fighters that they were called upon to refuel. Before the E-3 AWACS, they flew a Constellation with a lot of extra radar stuff, as you can see, mounted below and above the fuselage. This is a much older version of airborne radar control. Here you can see a better view of the massive radar and electronic arrays mounted on the EC-121. This is an RB-50, a derivative of the B-29 from World War II. You'll notice under the wings it's got jets and an external fuel tank. The RB-50 duty was pretty dangerous during the time after the World War II. They used these to skirt along the borders of the Soviet Union, sometimes do incursions to test their air defenses, and a lot of these airplanes were lost. It was kind of a quiet war that many Americans really weren't aware of happening in Eastern Europe and in Turkey. This is a B-52G. When I first saw this one, I thought maybe I'd flown this one too, but alas, I'd flown tail number 0182, not 183. This is a G model, which meant it was a water wagon. And what I mean by that is that when the throttles were set for takeoff, the pilot would flip a switch and it would dump water into the engines and give it a lot more thrust to get a heavyweight airplane off the ground. If you see the movies where the airplanes are taking off, throwing out a lot of black smoke, it's because they're doing wet takeoffs to get more thrust during that critical phase of flight. Airplanes just go on and on and on here. If you've never been here before, you could easily spend a couple of days.